So you're very warm welcome to all selected ladies and gentlemen to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021, organized by Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, India, in association with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha, Koraput. The broader theme of this international forum is agnotological contexts, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of CARD, my heartfelt thanks to Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Professor I. Rambrahma, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Central University of Koraput, and Professor S.K. Palita, Dean, Biodiversity, Central University of Koraput. I would like to thank the convener of this August conference, eminent historian of national repute, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminence policy activist and logician, Mr. Charudat Panigrahi, sir. Friends, in today's evening, we have with us Professor Yaseer Munif. Professor Munif is assistant professor of sociology at the Institute of Liberal Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies in Emerson College, Boston, Massachusetts, United States. Specialist on race relations, urban sociology, nationalism, political economy, and Middle Eastern politics and society. He also specializes in colonial history, racial identities, and production of post-colonial space in marginal sites in France and its colonial territories. His more recent research explores the importance of urban setting in shaping national identities during the Arab revolts, Egypt and Syria. So I would like to welcome Professor Yaseer on behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development and IIM Sambalpur and Central University of Odisha. And now I would like to invite Mr. Charudat Panigrahi to go for an introductory remark and then invite Professor Munif. Over to you, Professor Panigrahi.
Thank you. Thank you, Babu. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Professor Munif. I don't know what's the time at your end there.
It's 10 a.m.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
We are very happy to have you here and on a very topical issue. Is social sciences killing? That's of course you would speak more about this Syrian context, but overall this is a very tumultuous time because everybody everywhere is thinking about what are the human behavior aspects. I mean, why, what, where has gone wrong or is going wrong. While we are fighting the pandemic, we still have people who are more worried about racial discrimination, where people who are more worried about warding off immigrants from their countries, where people are still more engaged in all kinds of discriminatory uh, behavior and all kinds of volatile and extreme behavior, where we think that humanity should come together to fight such a pandemic. I mean, of course, we are doing our best. Of course, our sciences are doing well. So, what's in there for the social sciences? What are we looking at human behavior? How are we looking at human behavior and equity or inequities? And it will be very interesting to hear from you. Are we actually bridging the gap? Is social science or are social sciences more relevant today than ever before? Or are they losing steam? Are we giving more space to data sciences, to algorithms and other branches of science? And how pertinent and how relevant is social science today? While we are discussing all this, Professor Munif, I'd like to reiterate that this symposium that we have quite regularly is an international global symposium where we have very good you know, aspects and very good insights into various dynamics and various social issues. And the aim is to bring to the platform diverse issues, diverse thoughts, and to help all of us who are participating here to take this conversation to the next level, to the next orbit. So whether that will be in our own little circles or together we can build more platforms or proliferate this or expand this to a different scale is the underlying principle behind holding these kind of discussions. And your address today to all of us would help us understand and put a right perspective on social sciences during these troubling times. And troubling not only because of pandemic, troubling because while we are responding to the pandemic, or while some of us are responding to the pandemic, there are others, quite a number of us, um, who are more engaged in, as I told you, in all these practices which are very anti society, which is very anti development, which is very anti progress. So, so even the relevance of social sciences now come to a big debate, big question mark. Where are we now? And is this science actually social now? Or is the social science going to make us more social? That's the question. So we would be happy to have your address, and we'll also share our thoughts, our questions, if there are any. And our participants are young leaders, peer leaders, cross-section of the society from various professions, various backgrounds, and we would benefit a lot from your address today. We are very sure about that. I'm very sure about that. Welcome, Professor Munif. Over to you. You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you so much for this very generous introduction, and thank you for your important remark, and thank you for the invitation. I really look forward to a productive discussion today about the social sciences and the relevance of the social sciences. I'm going to talk about the Syrian context, but I think a lot of what I have to say is applicable in different ways about the pandemics and global politics today. And I chose a title that is quite provocative, The Social Sciences Kill. And I'm using the Syrian crisis as a case study. And I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. That's a question that I have been thinking about for a number of years as I was researching and studying the Syrian context, the Syrian revolution, the Syrian crisis, and thinking from my own standpoint as a sociologist, as a person who is invested in the social sciences. And therefore, how can we deploy the social sciences to make sense of what's happening in Syria and beyond the Arab, some people call it the Arab Spring, the Arab revolts. And so before I do that, I want to propose, and we can discuss that at the end, an ethical political theory, a theory that engages at the same time with the ethical, but also the political, that is seriously engaging with the ethical dimension as well as the political dimension, as you made it clear in your introductory remarks. And I think that is the role of the social sciences. The social sciences are not neutral in a context such as the one we live in right now. So briefly, I want to say a few words about, or maybe more than few words about the Syrian conflict to make sense and to be able to discuss and have some common ground. The Syrian revolt started in 2011, but dictatorship in Syria is much older. The Ba'ath Party took over in 1963, and Assad, the father, rose to power in 1970, and therefore the family has been in power at least for half a century, now 51 years between the father and the son. Syria is built on a security military foundation. And this is very important because Syria witnessed, people differ depending on who you ask and what historian, but around 17 to 19 coup d'etat. And therefore, Assad, when he came to power, he wanted to build a system that is coup-proof, that will enable him to stay in power for forever. And this is exactly what he did. And there are three foundations to that political power: the military security apparatus, the prison system, and the Ba'ath Party. And these are very important dimension in the Syrian context, without which I don't think we can really understand what is happening. And so when the revolt started in 2011, it wasn't really surprising. I mean, people were waiting for it, were expecting it, people living in the region, people living in Syria, not beyond, especially in Europe. And my remarks are gonna be about that. I spent quite some time in the Syrian liberated areas, and also in Damascus, starting in 2011 when the revolt started. And I did some ethnographic work, and I went to a number of places that were quite, you know, at the front line. People were fighting to see what is happening. And I also lived in Syria for a long time. I'm Syrian, and so I know the Syrian society, I know the Syrian context. And what I witnessed during the Syrian revolution is quite spectacular. People were rebuilding society from the ground up. They discovered that they didn't really need the state to run those different societies, cities, and villages. And they were taking care of the different institutions when the state left, and those areas were liberated. I'm talking about the bakeries and the production of bread. I'm talking about the garbage collection, the power plant, but also about the political process, and the Revolutionary Court were created, and the Revolutionary Council, to take care of all these different things that need to be taken care of in the liberated areas. The Syrian society created around 100 different newspapers and magazines. There were revolutionary councils everywhere, in every neighborhood and every village, thinking about how to organize the protests, the slogans, the flags, the banners, thinking about where to meet and how to discuss those crucial political issues. And one of the things that happened very quickly is Syria, I mean, politics in Syria was non-existent. Anyone who dared to get involved in politics was either put in prison, tortured, killed, exiled, and there is no real political space. And that's gonna be really important to understand the relevance of the social sciences. The lack of political spaces is a major dimension of the Syrian society. And so instead, people started organizing and meeting in mosques. It doesn't matter if you are pious or not. Many atheists were going to the mosque, communists, socialists, Christian, were going to the mosque to organize, because that's the only space where you can talk and have a discussion. And I was on a tour in the South, in the US South, to look at the civil rights history. And one of the things that is really interesting, and that's a parallel between the South and Syria, is the importance of the Black church. During Jim Crow, during white supremacy, when Black people had no rights, the only space where they could really organize was the church. Anytime more than three Black people were together, they were facing white violence and white supremacy. And therefore, the church played a major role in the political process in the South. And this is an important parallel between what happened in the US, in the South in the US, and what happened in Syria. Because oftentimes people conflate this institution, the mosque, and pious and non-pious people meeting together with Islamism, with fundamentalism, with extremism, and so on. And I think this is one of the issues that we need to talk about. So, so in order to understand the Syrian process or the Syrian crisis, I think it's important to think about different maps and overlapping those different maps to understand, instead of producing one linear hegemonic narrative and say this is what is happening in Syria. I propose instead to think about different maps, and one of them is the revolutionary process. What are people doing, the different practices and thoughts and the institution that they are creating, the revolutionary process from the ground up. Another institution, another map we can think of is the struggle. The Kurds are an important ethnic group in the region, and they were functioning and operating and struggling for self-emancipation and independence. But oftentimes their logic and their struggles don't fit within the revolutionary process very, very neatly. There are also regional and international powers that were operating and serving their own interests and pushing for their own interests. And therefore, they're viewing the Syrian conflict as a proxy war to advance or to further their interests. And there are also the Islamists, the extreme Islamists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, who were implementing their own internationalist agenda. And so oftentimes people try to conflate all these narratives into one single narrative, and I think this is not productive. And instead, I think it's important to engage with those different dimensions. Oftentimes, they don't necessarily follow the same logic. So with that said, I want to push back against the ways that people read the Syrian revolution and the theories, the social sciences, the kind of social sciences that they deploy to understand the Syrian context. And I will start with Orientalism, but I also will engage with the idea of geopolitics and international relations. And finally, the new social movements. So 3 paradigms that I will present very quickly and criticize: Orientalism, geopolitics, and the new social movement, and show their deficiencies or their inadequacy in order to understand what is happening in Syria. And I will also argue that these perspectives, these framework, allowed the Syrian regime to dehumanize the revolutionary process, the people who were struggling on the ground, and that led to the killing of many, many people. And thus, the reason of choosing that title, that the social sciences really killed people in Syria and elsewhere. I don't think this is unique to Syria. I think that the same logic applies to many contexts. Let's start with Orientalism. When the Syrian revolt and the Arab revolt started, Europe was very curious. I mean, I'm talking about academia and European universities and academics and scholars in Europe who are embedded in an Orientalist framework, and we're trying to project the European narrative or the European history into what is happening in Syria and the Arab revolt. So some of them saw the 1848 national revolts, and we're trying to project that European history into the Arab revolts. And I think there is a whole spectrum of Orientalism. It's not just one specific brand. There are people who were much more sympathetic to what's happening in the Arab revolt, in the Arab region, in Syria, and all the way to the most racist white supremacists. So I think it's important to understand Orientalism as a spectrum, as opposed to one singular dimension. And so there are those who supported the Arab revolts and the Syrian revolt, but they were trying to fit it within a European, Eurocentric narrative. And therefore, they were viewing what people were doing in Syria and elsewhere in the Arab region as following the path of the revolts in Europe. And I think that's very very simplistic and very limited, and it led to a major misunderstanding of what's happening. And then there are those people who are white supremacists, all the way Orientalist, hardcore Orientalist, and were viewing the revolt in the Arab region as Islamists taking over from secular regime. And for them, it doesn't matter if there are brutal dictatorships like the Mubarak regime or Gaddafi, or in the Arabian Gulf or Syria. What was frightening for them is that some pious people, some Islamists in Egypt and Syria and elsewhere, and some white supremacists, some Nazi parties in Europe were even joining the Assad forces to fight on the ground. If you go to some Nazi websites, sometimes they sell T-shirts and they have slogans with Assad, pictures of Assad in Europe, and they feed into each other. And so that's the Orientalist perspective, and that Orientalist perspective really silenced the revolutionary and dehumanized them and reduced anyone who opposed the Assad regime to an Islamist, to Al-Qaeda member, to an ISIS member, and prevented people from having a voice, really. The second perspective that I want to propose, I think there is an issue with the recording, or should I go ahead with? Okay, I'll
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, so the second perspective is geopolitics or international relations. And again, I mean, a lot of the social sciences really are embedded into that perspective. I'm not advocating for dismissing geopolitics or international relations, but I think we have to be really careful when engaging with that perspective. When we talk about geopolitics, what we have in mind is a state system. What we're thinking about is thinking about society and social processes from the standpoint of the state and the state interests and state institutions, and the same is true for geopolitics. And therefore, in the beginning, when the revolt started in 2011, I was surprised to see people I would have thought would support the struggles of the Syrians on the ground and the struggles of many Arabs and people in the region. And instead, we saw them supporting brutal dictatorships, such as the Syrian one. And I'm talking about progressive forces, some socialist parties, some European and American communists, and beyond. It's not just European, who very quickly sided with the Syrian regime. And the reasoning, the rationale for that is that Syria as a state, as a regime, is against the US, is perceived as a supporter of the Palestinian struggle, that they support Iran and Hezbollah, and therefore they are anti-imperialists. And therefore, anyone opposed to the Syrian regime, against dictatorship, against the brutal prison system in Syria, is by definition manipulated, or worse, is just conspiring against the Syrian state, who is anti-imperialist. In Syria, through that framework, Syria opposed to the US and Europe, Syria and Iran as two states that are perceived or categorized as anti-imperialist, and understanding everything through that prism, or using the state as a unit of analysis, I think is very reductive. And again, and we can talk about that in the discussion, I'm not proposing or advocating for a complete dismissal of geopolitics or international relations. What I'm advocating for is using geopolitics and international relations and the social sciences that function within that logic, in addition to social sciences that are much more attentive to the human being, to the social processes from below, not just what is happening from above. Simply put, what I'm saying is opposing or using several frameworks to understand those social processes, the revolution in Syria, using a politics from below, or what I'm calling in my book, the politics of life, as opposed to a bottom-up, a top-down reading, or what I'm calling again in my book, the politics of death, which is really centered around the state, which further the interest of the state. Anyone who is opposed to the state is labeled, in different ways. And we can talk about that. Some people will say, oh, they are terrorists because the state in Syria is a legitimate state, it's part of the state system, and Syria has its own sovereignty, and anyone opposed to the Syrian regime is challenging that sovereignty. And so we can talk also about what sovereignty means. Do we have to reduce sovereignty to the state system, or is there a popular sovereignty? Do people have the right to resist when they are slaughtered, when they are killed, when they are massacred at the industrial scale, like in Syria and elsewhere? Or that's not really a concept that we can use, popular sovereignty as opposed to state sovereignty. And I think those issues are extremely relevant for the social sciences. I don't think that the social sciences tackle or address them enough, but as the Syrian case shows, we have to really address them. Otherwise, we are bound to repeat the same mistakes, and lives are going to be lost. And so again, is it possible to think about a progressive or an emancipatory geopolitics or not? Is it possible to think about international relations that further people's interests, not simply state interests? Big question mark. Are the geopolitics always opposed to people's interests and people's lives and people's livelihood? So that's the second dimension that I've been very critical of in the book. And again, I'm not entirely dismissing it, but I'm advocating for complexifying our discussion of geopolitics and international relations, and not simply reducing it to thinking through the prism of the state. Finally, the third perspective I want to criticize, and that is quite popular, especially when it comes to thinking about social movement and the Arab revolts and elsewhere. It's not specific. That is the new social movement theory. And I've seen it deployed and utilized in the Syrian context and the Arab context. And I think oftentimes it's very misleading. And I said earlier that one of the problems of the new social movement theory is that it's Eurocentric. It was developed and it was taught in a European context. And it can be very effective to think about and to analyze and examine social movement in Europe and contexts that are similar to the European context. But I don't think they are very effective in thinking through that kind of theory in the Syrian context or the Arab region. Just to give you an example that I used earlier, the new social movement theory presupposes the existence of political and civic spaces, and it operates within that framework. And therefore, when those spaces are inexistent, like in Syria, bringing new social movement to think about the Syrian context or Syrian society can be extremely misleading. And it leads to major failures. And it leads to some people using that theory and finding that there is no social movement in Syria. There are no social movement really in Europe, because they don't fit the European framework, the ready-made blueprint. And therefore, their conclusion is that those social movements are inexistent. And again, they participate in invisibilizing the Syrian struggles, the Arab struggles, invisibilizing the people who are struggling on the ground, denying people on the ground any kind of agency because they don't fit to their theory. And therefore, I think this is not a new problem. I think the social sciences have always been facing that issue. And so when the theory doesn't fit reality, what do we do? Do we kill the reality and torture reality to fit into the theory, or are we open-minded and we think that our theory is lacking, and therefore we need to rethink our theory and start from the local practices, the local thinking, what people are doing on the ground, as opposed to denying people any form of agency or politics because simply they don't fit those theories that we are deploying. And therefore, again, anytime people try to function in political spaces and try to replicate the political politics as in Europe in a Syrian context, as I said, people will end up in prison, they will end up tortured, they will be disappeared, they will be exiled, oftentimes they will be killed on a industrial scale. And therefore, people have to be creative, they have to be inventive. For example, Asif Bayat, who wrote a really important book about the life as politics, uses the concept of social non-movement to talk about those movements that don't fit into the European framework and yet are existent. They don't fit into the new social movement theory, but yet are operating, they are struggling, they are resisting, they are pushing back. And so that's why I've been critical, and I've wrote quite extensively about that framework in the book, and we can discuss that in the discussion. Finally, I want to say a few words about, so what then? What do we do? And what I'm proposing is what I said in the beginning, is an ethico-political theory that is not simply attentive to the state, to Eurocentric framework and theories, but also it's ethical and put the human being and the human agency and marginalized identities, women and ethnic minorities and religious minorities and so on at the center in order to understand what is happening. And therefore, to give a quick example of what I mean by that is we need to look at what people are doing on the ground. And in one of the chapter, I use the politics of bread as an example of what needs to be done in order to produce this alternative theory. This theory is not, it's not a grand theory. It's not a complete theory. It's iterative. It's recursive. It's improved by trial and error. It's experimental. And so, in the case of bread, as a way to understand what's happening on the ground, I use bread because it's an essential commodity in a time of war, and we can use the vaccine in the context of COVID as to replicate the same kind of study. So if we use bread, an essential commodity in the Syrian context, even before the Syrian revolution, Syrian, and I think this is not unique to Syria. I think many people in the global South are similar, get 40% of their calories from bread. And so bread is really an essential commodity. And it became even more so during the war. And the Syrian regime obviously understood that and weaponized bread very, very quickly. For example, it denied people the circulation of wheat or the exchange of wheat in the liberated areas. It targeted the bread lines when people were waiting to get bread, oftentimes for hours because of the shortages. The Syrian regime attacked those bread lines and attacked fuel gas stations for the same reasons. And so it weaponized bread. And so people had to think about how to produce and distribute and consume bread in inventive or creative ways. And so looking at the production, circulation, and consumption of bread as an entry point to understand the Syrian revolt, as an entry point to understand the social practices of the people struggling on the ground, facing that monumental violence, I think is a productive way to think about what the social sciences mean in a context like the Syrian one. Or, again, to give the example of COVID-19, and I've seen it here in the US, and I think this is true elsewhere, how people organized when the state completely disappeared, and organized to provide food and provide care, and self-organize in the absence of the state. And so using COVID, again, as an entry point to understand what's happening at the local level can be very productive and will help us rethink the social sciences in productive ways. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions or develop some of the ideas I proposed. But
thank you, Professor Munif. Now I would like to request Professor S.K. Palita from Central University of Odisha to go for a concluding remark. Then we are going to start the question answer session. Over to you, Professor Palita.
Thank you, Rudranarayan and organizers. At the outset, I must thank Professor Yaseer Munif for detailedly discussing the problems taking place in Syria and its social ramifications and others. And he has broadly dealt what is going to take place, what is taking place there, and what are things expected, and what is its ramifications in the entire Arab world and other parts of the country, other parts of the world. I think he very nicely elaborated about the different groups which are active there and what is the impact on them. And it is a very nice deliberation, and I have nothing more to add to it because it's very nicely added. I think now it can be open for discussion, for interaction.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Palita. Now over to Professor Samuel Lima to conduct the question answer session. Over to Professor Lima.
Thank you so much. But if Professor Munif will read out the questions and accordingly, it will be better for him. Professor Munif, can you hear me?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
If you'll read out the questions and accordingly, you can answer the questions.
Okay. Yeah. So I see questions in the chat. The first question I see: the Syrian crisis started from small pro-democracy movement against President Assad autocratic rule. Very soon it engulfed the whole country. Is there any super behind it, sir? Why so-called superpowers not taking any attempt to check the Syrian civil war? So I think I addressed some of that in the discussion. It really depends on, as I suggested earlier, I think it's productive to think about the Syrian context through those different maps. And depending on what map we choose, we're going to end up with different assessment and different conclusions. And so the powers that are involved in the Syrian conflict, they are regional and they are international. Just to name few, there is obviously Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and there are international powers as well, such as Russia, the US, and so on. And we can construct a map to understand their logic and their involvement in the Syrian context and their interests. I mean, the reason why they are involved in the region, I think for the most part, is not to save lives, or it's not for ethical reasons. It's to further their own interests, and obviously they have contradictory interests. But I think stopping at that level, and there are countless studies that have been produced, and I think we can easily go back to some of them to understand what Russia really needs and wants from the Syrian revolt, what Iran is doing, and how is it building its regional power. The same thing can be applied to other powers in the region and beyond. But as I said, it's important to not limit our understanding and our analysis or examination of the situation to that geopolitical level. And instead, in addition to that, I think it's important to look at the micro level or micropolitics. So there is macro politics and there is micropolitics. And if we don't think about micropolitics, I think we're going to miss the point. Because as I said before, the state is, the geopolitics, and what this question is proposing is the geopolitical reading. Geopolitics in general invisibilizes the people. It's not an adequate framework to really understand what people are doing, how are they struggling, what are they doing with their resistance, how are they developing new strategies, and so on. They're simply not adequate. We can't deploy a geopolitical framework to understand the struggles on the ground. And therefore, in addition to the geopolitical dimension, what I'm proposing is that we think about the micro level, the micropolitics. There are different ways to name that. The politics of life, that's the concept I use in my book, or the politics from below. And so thinking about those two dimensions, I think, is extremely important for the social sciences, not simply taking one perspective as opposed to the other. The near about 5 deaths caused due to the ongoing civil war reflect the human consequences of the conflict. Do you think a political solution to the Syrian conflict is possible? And what is the impact of the Syrian crisis in neighboring countries? That's a great question. And I think what the Syrian crisis, the Syrian revolution, the Syrian civil war, and I think there is a politics of naming, depending on which one of those you use, people will put you in one category or another. But I think that what is important to understand is that there is the end of a social order in the region with the beginning of the revolt in 2011. And no matter what happens, there is no going back to that social and political order. It's a bit similar to what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. There is no going back to that. So it's going to take many years because the dictatorship in the region are old and are resisting, and there are powerful counter-revolutionary forces. And I think in the coming years, maybe decades, people in the region are going to be struggling with that. But it's not going to be very clear what is going to happen in Syria, because there are so many moving parts, right? And it depends on so many factors. So I think it's difficult to really predict, what's going to happen in a month or a year from now. But I think eventually dictatorship is over. I think dictatorship was over in 2011 when people discovered that they don't really need those despotic rulers, and that they are able to run their own neighborhoods and their own cities and villages by themselves, and they are able to produce more democratic frameworks and institutions. So the question is going to be what kind of political alliances people are going to build in Syria and beyond, and how to go forward. And unfortunately, the level of violence is, there is an ongoing low-intensity war, not only in Syria, but the entire Arab region. People think that the Egyptian revolution is over. I think there is a low-intensity war in Egypt as well as in Iraq and elsewhere. Counter-revolutionary forces reassembled and are powerful and trying to preserve the old order. But I don't think that the old order can be preserved. It can last for longer, but I don't think it can be preserved. So the next question is about the situation is what the Syrian is facing today are not so far away that the liberal democracies are going to face tomorrow. The unemployment problems in liberal democracies has already been started due to infotech revolution. artificial intelligence in the name of reasonable restrictions. Democratic countries like India also restrictions voice of dissent and right of protest. How you look at the situation? Your comment, please. No, I agree. I think that there is a global crisis. It's a crisis of the nation state. It's a crisis of democracy. It's an economic crisis. And we see that in countless situations in Europe, in the US, with the rise of fascistic parties almost anywhere. I mean, almost everywhere. Even in France, where Macron started as a liberal and is now building a police state. And this is true in Italy and in many countries where the old parties, the liberal parties, are losing legitimacy. People don't really vote for those democracies. Some of those parties really collapsed. I'm thinking about the Greek example where the center left and the center right parties really collapsed in 2013, 14 during the Greek crisis, where a party went from 30-40% of the vote to 5% almost overnight. And we see that over and over again in many parts of the world, where those parties are losing its legitimacy, and parties on the left, the radical left and the radical right, are gaining momentum and now are winning elections. So big question mark. I think that social movements have to be much more creative in the future. They have to network and think beyond the national. They cannot just learn in the Syrian context because the Syrian regime was able to besiege the revolution and kill that revolution. People have to build networks that are transnational, are that think beyond the national. So I think that there is so much to say about that. But what about your perspective on U.S. intervention in the Syrian civil war? I think that again there is a lot that has been written about the U.S. and the civil war in Syria. And again, I think that this is one dimension of what is happening, and we cannot reduce the situation in Syria to simply that dimension. Obviously, the U.S. has interest in the region. There is plenty of oil in the region. Syria, the U.S. has an interest in shutting down the Iranian nuclear program, and all these, and also the question of Palestine and Israel. All these dimensions are important for the U.S. when it comes to their involvement in Syria, and they're thinking about those different dimensions as opposed to the people on the ground. And that's why I think using that framework, that geopolitical framework, and reducing the situation in Syria and the civil war in Syria to simply that framework is going to limit our understanding of what's happening. The next question is about how you relate to Islamophobia within the Syrian crisis. I think I addressed some of that with my remarks about Orientalism. There is obviously Islamophobia within Muslim countries. It's not simply a process that is relevant in Europe and the West in general. I think that there is Islamophobia among the elites in Syria who sided with the Assad regime, who perceived Assad as a secular force, and therefore they deployed that Islamophobia. And the Assad regime obviously was a major force in developing that Islamophobia. That anyone who opposed him is by definition therefore an extremist and an Islamist, an Al-Qaeda or ISIS sympathizer, and that's why they are opposing the Assad regime. It's not about dictatorship. It's not about the despotic regime. It's about the Syrian regime being secular and ruling a secular Syria, as opposed to Muslim fundamentalists trying to overthrow that secular regime. And there are different dimension to that. I mean, when people, and I went to the mosque, and I'm not religious, I'm really atheist. I went to the mosque to participate in some of the protests. Many communists and socialists went to the mosque to participate in the protest. And I mentioned that earlier to show that those are one of the, I mean, the mosque is one of the few institutions that are still available to people in the Arab region to do politics. And therefore people obviously use that space to operate. The other thing I would say is that how the Syrian regime and other brutal regime used state feminism to or instrumentalize state feminism to demonize protesters, saying that the Syrian regime is for women's rights and so on, when at the same time it was raping and torturing women, and there are the Syrian prisons are full of women. And so I think it's important to think about what feminism means and what are different dimensions of feminism. I teach feminism, and I think one of the important things I say is that that there are different brands of feminism, that we cannot reduce feminism to one singular narrative. And the Arab brutal dictators have often used state feminism, and that's true in Tunisia, when the dictators used feminism or state feminism, I should say, to demonize the protesters, reducing them to Islamists, and that once they gain power, they are going to oppress women, and the only guarantee women rights are preserved is the brutal dictatorship in Tunisia, or the brutal dictatorship in Egypt, or the brutal dictatorship in Syria. And that feeds into the Islamophobia, that Muslims are by definition anti-women, that Muslims are by definition oppressive, and so on. And anyone who's pious is reduced to, is perceived as a potential terrorist. So I think, and as I mentioned, there are white supremacists and Nazi who join forces with the Assad regime as a result, because they saw the brutal violence that the Syrian regime was deploying against the Syrian population as an extension to what Nazi and fascists and white supremacists were doing in Europe, and that their fight and their struggles is in many ways similar to the Syrian regime struggles in Syria. The next question is about social science. The social studies always ignorance the social issues in terms of pedagogical understanding of information. Why? I think this is a great question. I would simply say, I think this is a gigantic topic that we can discuss for hours. I would simply say that one of the issues is the lack of access to the Syrian context, and people were producing study after study after study without ever having put foot out, knowing the history of Syria. And instead, you know, if we want to go back to what I said, deploying a ready-made theory, for example, new social movement theory, expecting to find what they usually find in a European context. And obviously, as I said, this theory is not adequate and therefore inapplicable. But one of the issues is really the lack of access to a zone that is violent, and the Syrian regime really imposed a blackout to prevent happening what happened in Egypt, where at some point there were 500 news outlets in Tahrir Square covering every pulse of the protesters, every move that they were doing. And that led to the collapse of the Egyptian regime. And so the Syrian regime was watching what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia, and obviously didn't want it to happen in Syria. And one of the things that it did was to impose a complete blackout. So I can keep going with the question. Looking at the time, do you have an hour or more? I just want to make sure I'm not.
Sir, if you go very briefly about the answers, it will be good for us. Within 15 to 30 seconds, you will conclude the answer to the questions.
Cover the rest of the questions?
Okay. Please go for all questions, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the next question is, why is there increase in refugee crisis in Syria? Can you throw some lights on this? So the refugee question is, I think, extremely important. And again, it was used as one of the bargaining chips for many forces in the region. So just to give a quick example of the cynicism of the states that are involved and other forces that are involved in the Syrian crisis, and how they instrumentalize the refugee question. So an example of that, the Syrian regime used the refugees as a bargaining chip against the neighboring countries, threatening to push more refugees into their countries if they didn't side with the Syrian regime. To give you an example of that, Lebanon had almost a million refugees, around 25% of the population. And so you can, see the level of the crisis in Lebanon, and they were taking the threats of the Syrian regime very, very seriously. So the Syrian regime used that as a bargaining chip against its neighboring countries. Turkey used the refugees as a bargaining chip against Europe and was threatening to open the gates. And we saw the flow of refugees in 2015 when Egypt was bargaining with Germany and other European powers about the economy and about the Iranian genocide. If Europe said anything about the Armenian genocide, or if Europe didn't allow Turkish workers to go to Germany because there are many Turkish workers in Germany, and so on and so forth, they would open the gates, and they did in 2015. And so the European forces take that very seriously with Turkey, and that's not unique to Turkey. It's true to Libya and other forces that are preventing the refugees coming from sub-Saharan Africa and trying to go to Europe. And so there are all these countries on the Mediterranean are acting as gatekeepers. To go back to Syria, ISIS used the crisis, the refugee crisis, as a way to put pressure on Europe, sending the message that any refugee is a potential terrorist, and instrumentalizing the refugees for its own purposes. And obviously that was extremely detrimental to the refugees. So obviously the far right in Europe used the refugees again in a Manichaean way, projecting the opposing perspective to ISIS, that every single refugee is a potential terrorist, and therefore we should prevent refugees from coming to Europe because they are Muslim, they are extremists, and so on and so forth. And there are countless cartoons showing and portraying refugees as rats and what have you. And I think, again, I mean, this is not unique to Europe, and the role of the social sciences in that question, humanizing refugees, not reducing them to numbers. And for example, the refugees, one of the things that refugees wanted is really to go back to their countries. I mean, they're not really interested in being uprooted and ending up in a racist village in Germany where everyone is attacking them. And so this misunderstanding of refugees, one of the things that the German and other European powers did was to disperse the refugees because they didn't want any hubs, thinking that that might be a potential terrorist threat. And so again, uprooting the refugees not only once but twice and third time and so on, moving them to very brutal camps and detention centers and so on. I think that's a massive question that we can again discuss, but it's an important one. What about the children's emotional scars from the Syrian civil war? That's I think that's a very extremely important question. There was a really sad video that went viral a few months ago, when a father who taught his toddler kid, girl, to laugh every time she heard bombing in their neighborhood, in their city. And so, I mean, you see how people try to co-op and adapt to extremely violent context. And so the child had no idea what was happening. And every time she heard a bomb, every time she heard an airplane, she was laughing, and it was just heartbreaking and disheartening to see that video of the parents trying to make, I mean, a context that extremely violent, genocidal, adapting that context to their kids, kids who are, I mean, operating in a context where schools are inexistent, where there is always food shortages, medication shortages, hunger, and so on. Again, a very important question. And if I see, what is your perception of India at micropolitics level in next 5 years? I have to say that I am very interested in the Indian context. It's such a complex context. I won't even try to predict anything, but I have an interest, and I have a number of Indian colleagues trying to understand what's happening. I mean, there are so many different local contexts, but I will just bypass this question because I'm really ignorant when it comes to the Indian context. But what I will say is that I think this idea of micropolitics, or the politics of life, is applicable everywhere. And we saw that, again, from my superficial understanding, with the COVID-19 crisis in India, and how the state and the local governments were dealing with that. And that in the end, people's organizing on the ground at the local level was oftentimes the only guarantee to saving lives. Is there any relation with oil diplomacy, like Cold Era time? That's an obvious yes. There is a substantive relationship with the oil, but again, I mean, reducing all that, I mean, there are people who are conspiration, driven by conspiracies and seek conspiracies everywhere, and they literally try to understand all the Arab revolts through where the pipelines, the location of the pipelines and the oil location, and try to understand that without any understanding of Arab society, Muslim societies, Arab histories, Syrian history, and reduce everything that is happening to a power play between regional and international powers fighting for oil, and seeing under every revolt and every village and every neighborhood that is part of the revolt as a conspiracy, because there is a pipeline beneath that revolt. And I think it's important to understand the importance of oil, but also not reducing it to that dimension. The next question is about how do we have a policy framework for Syrian conflict and evacuate the children suffering from the conflict and the pandemic? The problem are elevated. Again, I think the Syrian context is extremely difficult and heartbreaking. I don't know what is the solution for that, but I will say that one thing people understood from the Arab revolts is that we can't simply rely on the state, and oftentimes the state is the source of violence. And we can see countless examples of people coming together and organizing. And I'm not simply talking about Syria. We've seen that in Egypt, in Cairo and Alexandria. We've seen that in Tunisia and countless other places where people came together in the absence of state and took the matters in their own hands and started providing for the population, starting with the security, imposing checkpoints, and some of that, depending on the region, depending on the situation, can sometimes lead to violence. But for the most part, people in the neighborhood, people in the village, people in the city know each other and were able to impose security for the people. I think that's one of the important dimension in a time of revolt and rebellion. And we saw that in this Egyptian case, the police was always the source of violence and the killing, and the absence of police presence was the source of security and safety. And people were very very professional and very creative in taking the matters in their own hands. But then there is also much more than that, right? I mean, how do you operate without the state? And that's true for some region for now a number of years in the Syrian case where there is no state. And so how do you take care of the legal situation and the question of providing food and safety and the collection of garbage and so on. And I think there is no easy solution. It's different in every place, but we have to think beside the state, beyond the state, below the state, and not simply reducing our thinking as social scientists as simply also what can we do for ourselves in the absence of the state. I see a book. Okay. And so finally, the final questions are, thank you. I think I'm done with all the questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Munif. Now I would like to invite Professor Umakant Misra for the concluding remark on this topic. Professor Umakant Misra. Professor Misra, can you hear me? Umakant Misra. Professor Umakant Misra, can you hear me? Umakant Misra. Rudra, can you unmute Professor Umakant Misra? Rudra or Subham, anybody? Can you unmute Professor Umakant Misra?
Yes, we're trying.
Unmute Professor Umakant Misra.
Yeah, Professor Munir, can I just ask one last question before Professor Uma joined with us?
Please do, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. You talked about such a wonderful interactive session, and you talked about Syrian issue, the crisis all over, about the holistic approach of social science and the domain of science, how related to the pandemic all over, and we could not analyzing the theories and methodological aspect. My question is, you talked about there is no conspiracy of social movements said that in Syria related to this whole about your talk, what you highlighted the issues. My question is, why not social movement happened in Syria? And the second question, if so, then what is the policy perspective? It should be minorly can be adopted. Eurocentric notions always imposed their ideas, or the Americanization theories always imposed their ideas in terms of the quote unquote West ideas on East, or you talked about Orientalism. If you must read about Mr. Said's book about Orientalism, what he talked about in his book, there is less empirical analysis and more theoretical analysis, which is, I mean to say, the methodological aspect always lacking in terms of social science. What your answer?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an extremely important question for those of us who are interested in the social sciences. I teach a number of courses about the social sciences. global social movement. So a course is about the global social movement, and another one is about social movement here in the US, focusing on Black Lives Matter and social movement in the Arab world. And so my remarks were not about the absence of social movement in the Arab region or in Syria. It's about the inadequacy. Oh, sorry. So I'll go back. So what I was saying is that I have a deep interest in the social movements and the global social movement, and I teach a number of courses about the global social movement and the social movement and the crisis of neoliberalism, social movement here in the US focusing on Black Lives Matter, and also social movement in the Arab region in the Middle East. And so my remarks were not about the lack of existence of social movement in the Arab region or in Syria. It's about the inadequacy and the of the new social movement theory. What I was saying is that the new social movement theory is not applicable or transposable to the Syrian context in a simple way. And if we really want to apply it, we have to rethink it, maybe reconstruct it, maybe criticize it, complexify it. But deploying it, simply deploying it without thinking about the Syrian context is, I think, problematic. And the main reason I suggested is that the new social movement theory presupposes the existence of political spaces, of civic spaces that are oftentimes inexistent in the Syrian context. And therefore people cannot really operate in the way that is theorized in this new social movement. It doesn't mean that they are not resisting, they're not organizing. On the contrary, they are. But we cannot use those theoretical tools that are available to us from the new social movement to try to understand their resistance. And as I suggested, there are a number of books, and I think people who have been developing theories that are more adequate to social movement in the Arab world in non-European context that I think are much more productive. And so that was my critique of the new social movement theory. And in many ways, the new social movement theory is Eurocentric, and we need to also, in a certain way, decolonize it, right? And think about how do we think about social movement through a context that is not European? How do we build a social movement theory in a context such as the Syrian one? And I think it's important to start from the bottom up, and not necessarily apply every conceptual tool. And I think in some cases, the new social movement theory can be quite extensive in the conceptual tools that it makes available. But again, oftentimes those tools are obsolete. They're not adequate when it comes to the Syrian context. And therefore, people end up not finding social movement in that region when they do exist. They end up silencing and invisibilizing people, and they end up making the Syrian revolution and other revolts unthinkable simply because they don't fit into their ready-made and pre-packed kind of social movement theory. And so again, what I was advocating for is a social movement theory that start really from the nitty-gritty and the messiness of the revolt and the struggles. And if it starts there, I think it has the potential and it has a future. If it doesn't, I think it's going to be bound to make the same mistakes.
Professor Munir, I have a question. Hello.
Please.
Yes. How do you compare the Afghanistan issue, the socio-political changes taking place in Afghanistan after the retreat of US to that of the Syria?
I think that's an extremely important question. But I think the main difference between Afghanistan and Syria is the entry point. Afghanistan was not really experiencing or witnessing a monumental revolt when the US invaded it and started an imperial war in Afghanistan, while Syria it was. And what I'm talking about is people organizing massive protests against dictatorship in Syria. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people protesting in Aleppo and in Homs and in Damascus, and hundreds of local councils being created, hundreds of newspapers and Facebook pages and blogs and YouTubes being uploaded, and a revolutionary movement that was massive. I mean, we've never seen anything like this in the past maybe century. There was a revolt against the French in 1920s. And so it's important to start from that point where people were in, hello?
Professor Munif, you go ahead.
Yeah, I think there was some echo. And so I think that's the starting point. There was a massive revolutionary movement. People created a revolutionary council, revolutionary court, and they were creating a labor movement for the first time in a long time. The Syrian regime crushed the union, the independent union in 1980 and 1982, and the first independent union was created in 2012 in Manbij, and there were a number of other unions that were created. So I mean, this is the general context of Syria when the US and other forces started interfering. And I think this is extremely important because some people will use the intervention of Russia, Iran, the US, France, Turkey as a pretext to discounting or to invisibilizing or to dismissing any revolt. And I think this is a grave mistake, because anytime there are revolts, and we can go back in history and you're gonna see, I mean, look at, I was reading a book about the Haitian Revolution. I mean, there were 4 imperial powers that were interfering and were present and were attacking as the Haitian Revolution was happening. There was the British, the French, the Spanish, and the US. Same thing with the Russian Revolution. I mean, countless forces were interfering, and same thing with the Spanish revolt or revolution. And so when there is a revolutionary process or situation, there are a number of powers, regional and international, who are, no matter what, are going to get involved because they want to be to make sure that any power that is put in place is allied with them as opposed to allied with their enemies. And so I think it's very important to understand that, use it as one of the factors that we have to deal with in a revolutionary situation, and not dismiss any revolutionary situation or context whenever there is regional and international power interfering. I mean, there is no way to prevent international and regional powers from interfering. They will always do. And there will never be a situation where revolutionaries will be able to operate in an ideal situation without regional or international interference. And so what I'm advocating for, and what I have been writing about, and I always write and always I'm an activist and organize, I'm one of the co-founders of the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution, is to think about that intervention, international or regional, as one of the factors that is going to complexify the revolutionary process, and not dismiss the revolutionary process simply because powers are interfering. So, and I think this is a question that we're going to have to tackle more and more, because there are revolts everywhere, and there are states and countries that are going to interfere no matter what, and we cannot prevent them from doing so because they are powerful. The question is, how do we make sure that the revolutionary process is supported, is highlighted, that people understand what is happening, as opposed to dismissing a revolutionary process whenever a power interferes because of geopolitics and because of international relations. And I think I made that clear, but it's important to understand both those dimensions, geopolitics and international. Have in mind and what they're doing and their politics, but also not because of that dismiss the revolution process.
Thank you so much, Professor Munif. Thank you so much and very much, Professor Munif, for joining us and being with us. And we talked about, you gave us a very brief overview about the Syrian revolution. And also, you are also the co-founder of the, it is a kind information for all the participants and viewers. You are also the co-founder of the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for accepted our invitation to share your thoughts and about this topic. And you also joined us all the way from Boston, and we all are grateful and thankful to you, Professor Munif. And I also thank to all the participants, those who have joined in this Zoom meeting, and also all the viewers and the Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and all the participants. Thank you to all the students, researchers, teachers, professors, and academics, to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference. So on behalf of the organizing committee or this World Human Sciences and Management Conference, thanks to all the patrons of this program, Professor Jaiswal, the IIM director, Professor I. Rama Brahma, the Vice Chancellor of the Central University of Odisha, Koraput, the convener of the meeting, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, Mr. Charidatta Panigrahi, and also I am really thankful to Professor Sharat Kumar Palita, the professor of the Central University of Odisha, Koraput. Thank you, sir, Professor Palita, for being with us. And also I thank to all the coordinators, Subham Das, Kamal Prasad Mahanti, Ghanshyam Giri, Rudnayan Das, Chinmay Kumar Sahu. And also I'm thankful to Dr. Shyama Prasad Mishra, Professor Subhash Chandra Barik, and all the participants and the viewers. Thank you again, Professor Munif, for being with us and your precious time. And you also enlightened about the very useful topic, and this is also the need of the hour. Thank you, Professor Munif.
Thank you.
And we also look forward to see you in this future in person or in physical mode. Thank you, Professor Munif, and thank you to all. And also finally, I say thank you Dr. Vikram Kesharijana is the key person behind this meeting, and he is also the very industrious person. He is organizing and a person who gathered all of us together in this digital platform. Thank you, Dr. Jana, and also and thank you all. Have a good day to Professor Munif, and thank you to all the participants. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Professor Munif.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for very productive discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.